Good Boy is the latest horror film that's causing a little bit of a stir, not because of the ghosts, not even because of the human performances, but because of the dog. Good Boy is a supernatural horror film with a fairly straightforward premise. We have Indy the dog with no real sort of supernatural abilities who has to try to save his owner, Todd, from some sort of force that Todd cannot see. It's pretty shocking when you realize that there hasn't really been a horror film that has ever effectively used this premise, a horror film told through a dog's point of view. Anyone who has ever had a pet understands those moments where you're watching them and they're just looking or staring into a corner and you wonder, what are they seeing? That question is essentially the backbone of Good Boy. I actually had the chance to sit down with director Ben Leonberg, and so instead of me waffling on about what Good Boy is all about, I'll let him take over.
To boil it down to the origin story as succinctly as possible, I was watching Poltergeist for probably the thousandth time. And if you remember, that film begins with the golden retriever going through the house, clearly sensing that something supernatural is afoot before anybody else has. That was kind of the origin of this all. That, like, could you tell a story entirely from a dog's perspective? As an animal lover and someone who likes very difficult production challenges, that was really appealing to me. And then as a genre storyteller, figuring out how to have a story that would rely on like a more realistic, canine character who just has the limitations of a household pet, doesn't have a voice, no superpowers, and still tell this kind of compelling, suspenseful story.
What struck me most about Good Boy and what I think ultimately makes Good Boy an effective horror film is the somewhat ironic or counterintuitive idea that we empathize actually more with this canine friend than we do with human beings that we see on screen. Traditionally, in horror films, the humans, or at least some of them, have done something to get themselves into a situation, or at the very least, are not acting the way that we think they should in their situation. And this makes us a little bit upset with these human characters, perhaps our human protagonist. But in Good Boy, Indy the dog is pure, is completely innocent, and has done nothing to deserve these forces that are haunting him and his owner. Because of this, each and every moment increases in intensity because we so badly, we so deeply want nothing to happen to this good boy, to Indy. And on this note, a question that I was asked a lot just after my written review of this film is whether or not something happens to Indy. Is the dog okay? And I'm not going to jump into any spoilers right this moment, but you can see in the chapters below, you can skip to near the end where I will give you the answer to that question. But moving on. Indy is Ben's real life dog. He originally thought that they were going to get a trained dog for this role, but they ended up going with Indy. And because Indy is not trained to be on screen, it took quite some time. And by quite some time, I mean over 400 days of shooting spread out over the course of 3 years. They started with some proof of concept shots, even mirroring some shots from classics like The Shining, until they were confident that, yes, this is something they could do together. Eventually, when it came down to shooting the actual film, Leonberg incorporated some interesting and effective techniques when it came to the cinematography and decisions in lighting and lenses. And again, rather than me explain all that to you, Leonberg can probably do a better job himself.
The kind of shot you could set up in a conventional film where like a human actor walks into a scene, hits their little tape mark, and their eye light is hitting their like brow just perfectly. You can't do that with a dog whose range of possible endpoints is across the room. So you have to change, even how you're lighting and designing the, cinematography of it all. For stationary scenes where we can kind of position him, it's a little bit easier. So we were always trying to get a little bit of light on his eyes and then in his eyes. It's called ping, where there's that little reflected dot in a character's eyes. It just gives the audience a little bit of something to like glom onto as like this is important. Whatever he's seeing is important. So we are always trying to add an eye light and a ping light to Indy. And then besides that, it was just making him stand out in the environment that, the shots are either from his perspective or of him. For shots that are of him, we wanted the audience just to always easily know where he was so he would stand out from his environment, which is otherwise very dim and dark, and deliberately so. I used to work in apparel advertising, and I heard someone say once that if you have someone with great hair, just add backlight and they're going to look great. Apply that to a movie about a dog where your character is made out of hair. You can just add backlight and they kind of look dynamite no matter what. And then with the actual lenses themselves, you mentioned it's a lot of wide angle lenses, which were both really important for operating in the small kind of cramped space inside the house we were filming in. But then another advantage of working with a dog is that some of the things that would be really kind of aesthetically unpleasing about a super wide angle lens and a human character were great for a dog. If you film a close up on a person, it will really distort their face. Sometimes strategically, so like The Shining is the perfect example of this. Creepy shots of Jack Nicholson looking off into the distance with a 1,000-yard, dead-eyed stare. We've got this super wide angle lens in his face, and he looks crazier as a result. But for a dog, because their faces are shorter and their noses are so much longer, you don't get that same effect. And you get these shots of Indy where you've got this beautiful close-up of him, but you can see all of the dark corners behind him, which we sometimes use to build a scare or just create tension as well.
In Good Boy, we don't get all of the answers to the questions that we might have. We're never directly given information on the why. We don't have themes fully explained to us, which of course is intentional. And to me, the film is less about this haunting and it's more about the proximity to suffering. As we know, dogs can sense things before we can as humans, and Indy can really sense that something is wrong with Todd. And the horror really is this understanding that someone you love is suffering and there's nothing you can do to stop it. You just have to sit there and watch this destruction slowly unfold. And as a result, we are forced to sit with Indy as he tries to communicate these feelings of impending doom. And ultimately, this is a super effective way to communicate a feeling that we feel oftentimes as human beings. At the end of the day, Good Boy is not revolutionary, but it is a super tight 70-minute film with a unique concept that is well executed and definitely worth a watch and will have a place within this horror genre for years to come. Beyond all that, though, one thing is clear: we are all rooting for Indy.
In the biggest screening we had of Good Boy, which had the most people, which really magnified the audience reaction, the first frame, which is Indy sleeping on the couch, people went, "Aw," like audibly.
Yeah.
And it's just like, oh, okay, like everyone's on board.
Yeah.
You don't need to do anything else. Like, we want this guy to win and we don't want anything bad to happen to him.
Thanks so much for watching. At this point, I'm going to tell you, spoiler, whether anything happens to the dog. So if you don't want any spoilers, feel free to click out now. But without further ado, I'm happy to say that Indy survives. His human counterpart, well, you'll just have to see. Thanks again for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. All those things are super, super nice and help me and potentially feed into this terrible algorithm that gives me sustenance. So yeah, thank you, and watch the next one, please. Bye.